Imagine you're on a long flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing on a beautiful evening. You've gone through all the flight procedures and are ready to reach the mainland China early the next morning. However, what would happen if one day the flight time suddenly extends longer than expected? In 2014, a flight operated by Malaysia Airlines had an unexpectedly long journey that lasted over 9 years. This situation is the story of MH370, the mysteriously vanished aircraft. Many theories have been proposed, extensive searches conducted, but the result remains inconclusive. Was the aircraft involved in an accident and crashed straight into the deep ocean? Or was there some indirect terrorist force behind the disappearance? Everything is at a standstill, while the world and the loved ones of the passengers mourn for the ill-fated flight. How did this event unfold? What theories have been put forward to explain this mysterious disappearance? All will be revealed in the video. What happened to MH370? Before we begin, we sincerely hope that the audience can take a few seconds to subscribe to the channel and share to support the team, and not miss out on the next quality content. Now, let's get back to the main content. On the 9th of March, 2014, at Kuala Lumpur International Airport, a flight was preparing for takeoff. Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 was scheduled to depart at 12:41 a.m. and was expected to land in Beijing at 6:30 a.m. on the same day. Leading the flight was Captain Zaharia Massa, then 53 years old. He was one of the most experienced and respected pilots of Malaysia Airlines. Alongside him was First Officer Fari Hamid, 27 years old. He only had one more training flight left before receiving his full certification, which he eagerly anticipated. They led a crew of 10 flight attendants, all of whom were Malaysian. Additionally, there were 227 passengers from various countries, the majority being Chinese nationals. Everything proceeded very normally from the flight check-in process to takeoff. During the first 40 minutes of the flight, nothing unusual occurred. At 1:19 a.m., MH370 reached the Malaysian airspace boundary, where the air traffic control handed over the flight to the air traffic control in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. The captain responded with a standard "good night" message, forgetting to repeat the frequency, but this wasn't considered unusual. It was expected that the flight would smoothly pass through Vietnam and continue on to Beijing according to the schedule. However, what followed next became history, as no one could have anticipated that the captain's "good night" message would be the last communication heard from the flight. Just seconds after entering Vietnamese airspace, MH370 disappeared from the radar screen. It was not difficult to recognize that this was certainly an ominous sign. The air traffic control staff made efforts to communicate with the aircraft, but received no response signals. At this point, military radar had to be used to locate MH370. Strangely, the aircraft suddenly deviated from its northeastward course from Beijing to head westward, crossing the Malay Peninsula towards the Indian Ocean. Consequently, MH370 exited the range of military radar at 2:20 a.m., just 1 hour after takeoff. The aircraft lost all contact with air traffic control. What followed was prolonged confusion for both the air traffic control and the airline. News of the mysterious disappearance of flight MH370 spread rapidly. Authorities swiftly launched search efforts by all means possible. While the passengers' relatives awaited anxiously in Beijing, they couldn't have imagined that their family members might not be coming home. Everything happened unexpectedly, prompting the question of whether an international-scale search would be conducted. Indeed, had MH370 vanished, as soon as the severity of the situation was realized, search operations were initiated. According to recorded reports, the last known location of the aircraft was 122 nautical miles off the coast east of Kot Baru, Malaysia. Weather conditions were favorable that day, yet the aircraft vanished without any warning or distress signals. Strangely, somehow, the giant metal bird, MH370, disappeared. Malaysia collaborated with Vietnam to conduct a series of search and rescue missions for this missing flight. The search area was expanded to 50 nautical miles from the last known position of the aircraft, including the Balatka Strait. Many other countries also participated in this search campaign, including the United States, Singapore, the Philippines, especially China, the country with the most victims in this flight. No sign of MH370 was obtained. Therefore, the search area was further expanded, with the Malaysian government at that time deciding to increase the search range to 100 nautical miles, covering a larger area of the Gulf of Thailand between Malaysia and Vietnam. In the weeks following MH370's disappearance, searches focused on the Southeast Asian waters, and an investigation into the disappearance was launched. Malaysian authorities asserted that the aircraft continued to fly for several hours after losing contact with air traffic control. It is possible that the aircraft flew along one of two extended arcs to the northwest of Central Asia and southwest of the Indian Ocean. However, the northwest arc was ruled out due to lack of evidence. In the midst of the search, attention shifted to a more remote area unrelated to the flight path from Malaysia to Beijing, namely the southern Indian Ocean. On March 18, 2014, a search in this area was conducted, led by Australia. However, no signs of a plane crash, no debris were found. All fell into despair, and just under a week later, on March 24, 2014, the Prime Minister of Malaysia announced that Flight MH370 had ended in the southern Indian Ocean with no survivors. This conclusion outraged many, especially the relatives of the passengers and crew. Under the pressure of public opinion and the relatives of the victims on MH370, many other search efforts were conducted, with the participation of various organizations and countries. 6 months after the mysterious disappearance, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau organized a search. The Indian Ocean Search Authorities mobilized all resources, including autonomous underwater vehicles, to explore the ocean floor. In April 2015, Australia, China, and Malaysia decided to expand the search area by an additional 60,000 square kilometers, bringing the total search area to 120,000 square kilometers. The search area focused more on the southern Indian Ocean, along the 7th Arc, off the southwestern coast of Australia, about 2,500 kilometers from the coastline, extending down to the area between latitude 33 and 36 degrees south. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau relied on the drift theory to search for the aircraft. This method assumes that under pilot control, the aircraft could glide for an additional 100 hours after running out of fuel. However, this argument contradicted the data provided by Inmarsat satellites, which hypothesized that at the time of the crash, the aircraft nosedived at a speed of 4,570 km/h. Ultimately, the search efforts within this 120,000 square kilometer area yielded no trace of MH370. The search operation incurred costs of up to 180 million Australian dollars, with China contributing 20 million Australian dollars. Just when everything seemed to be at a standstill, a discovery brought hope to both search teams and the victims' families. Debris suspected to be from MH370 was found washed ashore on Réunion Island and the coast of East Africa. This raised doubts about the accuracy of the search area determination. Although only a few debris were recovered, they were enough to provide fragile hope for the world. Through research, experts from France and Malaysia confirmed that these were part of the wing and interior of MH370. The leaders of the three countries involved expressed optimism about the possibility of finding the wreckage of MH370 in the southern Indian Ocean. The debris was also sent for testing to determine if they belonged to the passengers on the flight. However, there was not enough evidence to conclusively prove that they belonged to MH370. Therefore, the longing of the passengers' families continued, becoming increasingly hopeless. Search options were also altered to quickly determine the actual location of the aircraft. Australia, Malaysia, China, and related countries agreed to deploy an underwater search in the ocean depths. However, to accomplish this, a very difficult problem had to be solved: how to determine the area where the aircraft crashed, based on the time of flight diversion and the distance flown until fuel exhaustion. Truly, it was extremely difficult when both factors were so vague and lacked concrete evidence in the search for MH370. A group called the Independent Group also joined the efforts. This is a network of about 20 individuals, including pilots, scientists, engineers, and experts from various countries. They came together with a common interest in unraveling the greatest aviation mystery in human history. For over 2.5 years, the Independent Group's search efforts have occasionally coordinated with the Australian Transport Safety Bureau. However, these two organizations disagreed on assessing the timing of MH370's southward turn, leading to some controversies. Despite numerous hypotheses, none of them yielded results. The massive and costly search operations ended in complete failure. No one could definitively say where MH370 was. Why did this happen? Answering this question isn't easy because the search scope is limited in the vast expanse of space. However, there were unforeseen shortcomings in the search operations that no one could predict. What was the main cause of these failures? It's the immense vastness of the Indian Ocean, but to some extent, one could argue that the search agencies, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau and the Malaysian authorities, had their own shortcomings. Australia's Minister for Transport at the time, Darren Chester, believed that human efforts are limited in a search operation deemed to challenge capability, expertise, and scientific technology. He himself admitted that, given the limited data in the early months of the aircraft's disappearance, the search coordination agency made some errors in determining the direction the aircraft veered. This caused delays and missed opportunities to find significant debris and data. Moreover, delays in cooperation and the Malaysian government's staunch secrecy attitude also rendered the search ineffective. Indeed, the host nation was reluctant to share data about the ill-fated MH370. This not only frustrated participating nations, but also enraged the families of the passengers. They staged protests demanding the government disclose full information for the victims to have a chance of being found. It must be said that it was an extremely crisis-ridden and pressured time for Malaysia and the countries involved in this campaign. However, the mystery remains unsolved, with no explanation for the disappearance of this aircraft. But how could a large aircraft like MH370 vanish without a trace? If it had indeed crashed into the ocean, debris and the black boxes should have been found. Many hypotheses have been put forward, each with certain arguments, but overall lacking in authenticity. What caused MH370 to meet its fate and become the greatest mystery in aviation history? Initially, all suspicions focused on the ill-fated flight's captain, Zahari Amasa, believed to have deliberately piloted the aircraft to disaster, intending to commit suicide along with the passengers and crew. According to reports from Atlantis, the captain signaled for the aircraft to climb to over 10,000 meters. An aviation expert also provided several conclusions supporting this theory. William Lang suggested that the captain took control of the aircraft and intentionally caused all passengers and crew on board to perish. the sudden depressurization and altitude increase of the aircraft to over 12,000 meters could render those in the cabin unconscious within minutes, ultimately leading to death without signs of suffocation. This was because the oxygen mask system cannot be used for an extended period. When the pressure changes suddenly, the masks activate for passengers to breathe. However, they are only effective for about 15 minutes at an altitude of around 4,000 meters. In the case of an altitude of 12,000 meters, this contingency measure becomes entirely ineffective, meaning passengers and crew would perish. Before crashing into the sea, MH370 turned into a flying coffin, with only one person, the captain, escaping the fate of oxygen deprivation and death, as he could utilize the oxygen supplying mask for many hours and calmly control the aircraft from the cockpit. Furthermore, before MH370 took off, the captain was the one who requested refueling for the aircraft. The estimated flight time from Clampuel was only 5 hours and 37 minutes. However, he requested fuel for 7 hours and 31 minutes, allowing the aircraft to fly an additional 2 hours. This enabled the captain to fly to the most remote areas of the Indian Ocean. Why would he request additional fuel if he had no intention of flying the aircraft to another area to commit suicide? Another detail discovered adds more credibility to this hypothesis. Captain Zahari was known to support the opposition party in Malaysia and was acquainted with the leader, Anna Ibrahim. However, just one day before MH370 took off, Ibrahim was sentenced to prison. It can be easily speculated that this may have spurred Captain Zahari to action. There is information suggesting that MH370 circled for about 22 minutes to negotiate Ibrahim's release. But since no agreement was reached, the captain decided to fly the aircraft to the farthest part of the southern Indian Ocean. A flight simulator was also found at the captain's home. It would be quite common for pilots to use simulators to hone their skills, but Zahari's simulator was used to chart a course to the southern Indian Ocean. Isn't this too much of a coincidence? Information from the simulator suggests that the captain likely devised a suicide plan. However, this is still considered insufficient evidence to confirm what happened on the night the aircraft disappeared. Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister of Australia, also added that senior Malaysian officials believed MH370 disappeared due to the pilot deliberately crashing the plane as a suicide. In response to Abbott's comments, the then Malaysian Prime Minister, Najib Razak, denied this. He disagreed that Malaysian authorities had ever considered this possibility, but refrained from publicly expressing an official stance. This was because it would be unfair and legally irresponsible since the black boxes and wreckage had not been found. Despite the debate, the captain remained the prime suspect for this aircraft's disappearance. However, the assertion that the captain was the main culprit also faced criticism from the public. Some argued that the captain was a successful individual with over 18,000 flight hours and had no issues with personal or financial matters except for an unhappy marriage. A talented individual like him would have no reason to commit suicide and take others with him. To this day, this remains an uncertain hypothesis, but many still believe that someone may have deliberately altered the flight path. Could Captain S.A. have made such a horrific decision? When the suicide pilot hypothesis lacks sufficient evidence, another possibility comes to mind. A pilot shared his thoughts with Chang Wet. Pris Goodfellow, with over 20 years of experience in aviation, suggested that a fire may have ignited in the avionics bay due to electrical arcing. In this case, the pilot's initial response would be to disconnect electrical circuits until the faulty circuit was isolated. Then, the aircraft would stop transmitting data to air traffic control. There may have been a fire in MH370's avionics bay, causing a severe emergency that required the pilot's full attention and aircraft control. Therefore, contacting air traffic control was no longer a top priority. If this indeed happened, it would easily explain the sudden change in the flight path, rather than heading to Beijing as scheduled. In the midst of chaos, Captain S.A. decided to seek the nearest airport for emergency landing. Goodfellow further asserted that experienced pilots always knew the nearest airports along their route for emergency landings. Pilots could also increase the aircraft's altitude to 13,000 meters, where the oxy density outside the atmosphere is the lowest, to extinguish the fire. However, at this altitude, it's challenging to keep the aircraft stable, even though the captain was highly skilled in control. Therefore, the possibility of the aircraft stalling could have occurred, causing smoke in the avionics bay to render the pilots unconscious, and the aircraft continued flying until it ran out of fuel and crashed into the Indian Ocean. If this were true, Captain S.A. attempted to save everyone, but ran out of time. However, this argument still seems plausible, but not entirely convincing. It fails to explain why the captain requested additional fuel for the aircraft, especially in 2014 when fuel costs were high, so the aircraft would only carry a sufficient amount. And even Goodfellow did not find any concrete evidence to support his hypothesis. Due to this gap, the avionics bay fire hypothesis still faces some opposing views. If it wasn't suicide or a fire, then the cause may require further investigation. At that time, the possibility of MH370 being the target of a terrorist attack was not ruled out. Malaysian officials revealed that they investigated and found 2 suspicious passengers who used stolen passports. These individuals purchased flight tickets through China SH Airlines, an airline sharing routes with Malaysia. They used documents belonging to an Austrian and an Italian national. The owners of these Austrian and Italian passports had previously reported them stolen in Thailand since 2012, prompting police investigation. Typically, only smugglers or illegal immigrants use fake identity documents. However, asserting that these passengers using fake passports were terrorists still lacks sufficient evidence. They could be thieves or simply purchased passports on the black market. A former member of the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board involved in this search operation also shared some information. The pilots could not make emergency calls, indicating that the aircraft may have exploded due to depressurization, or may have been destroyed by an explosive device. The event must have occurred very quickly, hence the inability to establish communication. It is possible that an organization or group seized control of the aircraft, forcing MH370 to crash into the Indian Ocean. Combined with the captain's request to refuel for over 2 additional hours of flight, many believe that everything was premeditated. It bears resemblance to a terrorism incident in 2006 when terrorists attempted to lower an aircraft in the Atlantic Ocean by using liquid explosives. It's challenging for people not to consider this hypothesis. According to a 2012 report by the U.S. Department of State, Malaysia is susceptible to terrorist activities. The country is considered a transit and planning hub for terrorism. However, Malaysia had not experienced serious terrorism in previous years. Some noted that the aircraft disappeared at the end of the annual session of the Chinese National People's Congress in Beijing. During this time, China was also facing increasing terrorism concerns. So it's plausible that someone planned to hijack the flight, which primarily carried Chinese passengers. However, no official terrorism connection has been established, and no organization has claimed responsibility. In the case of MH370, the possibility of this ill-fated aircraft being targeted by terrorists remains mere speculation. Scientific arguments fall short of satisfying everyone. As a result, many more mystical speculations about MH370 have emerged. Looking at it optimistically, many believe that MH370 fell into a time loophole. Why is this considered positive? Because in the past, there was a story of a missing plane returning 37 years after its disappearance. That's right. It's the story of a flight from New York in 1955 to Miami but ended up landing at a Venezuelan airport in 1992. The man who witnessed this strange event on Johandiak on May 21, 1992, is said to be the only witness. Johan was working in the air traffic control tower at Caracas Airport as usual when a Pan American DC-4 aircraft landed at the airport and contacted Johan for assistance. At that moment, he didn't realize anything unusual, but when he communicated with the pilot, he was extremely surprised. The aircraft bore the number 914, was en route from New York to Miami, had been in the air for 2 hours, and had 57 passengers and 4 crew members. However, the aircraft did not appear on the radar screen. Looking down at the runway, he felt even more bewildered. The aircraft's appearance was quite old, a type common in the 1930s, 1940s. Both Miami and New York are far from Venezuela, about 1,600 miles. Therefore, Johan was worried that the plane had lost its way. When he heard the name of the airport was Caracas, he was extremely shocked. The plane was supposed to land in Miami at 9:50 on July 1955. Johan continued to realize that there were too many anomalies here. He also reported that this was an international airport in the capital Caracas, Venezuela, and that day was May 21, 1992. When airport staff approached the 1955 aircraft, the pilots refused and chose to leave. People at that time recounted seeing passengers on Flight 914 pressing their faces against the windows, looking at everything with curious eyes. This strange incident was reported to the Venezuelan air traffic control authorities. An investigation was launched, but all issues led to a dead end, and no evidence was found. To this day, no one knows where that plane came from, whether it really disappeared in 1955 and passed through a time loophole to arrive in 1992. Many still question, is this a fictional story, or did it really happen in Venezuela? This tale of a time-traveling plane has somewhat helped us think about a more positive outcome. Someday, MH370 might suddenly appear in the airspace of a certain country, with all passengers and crew on board. Then what? Everyone is fine, returning home and reuniting with family and loved ones. And the aircraft encountered no problems, not crashing into the sea. At that point, the greatest mystery in the history of aviation will be elucidated. This ending is much more beautiful than many hypotheses explained by science. 9 years have passed, and information about the Boeing 767 bearing the code MH370 remains elusive. The plane's wreckage has not been found. The fate of the victims has become a question mark, the greatest aviation mystery in human history. The families of the passengers and crew have endured this indescribable pain. They worry. They are horrified to witness their loved ones disappear without a trace, feeling hope only to be disappointed, then fearful again. Thousands of emotions torment the relatives, friends of the victims. However, there is a greater fear in their hearts, as well as many others around the world, that MH370 will gradually fade into oblivion. And no one will mention this ill-fated flight anymore. The world's public opinion is, and will overcome the pain. Humanity's concern is no longer for MH370. Only they, the relatives, still wait for the victims in despair. One man had to endure that extreme pain, that loss. That man is Gilos, a forensic engineer, whose wife and 2 of his 3 children are believed to have perished along with other passengers on flight MH370. Like other victims' families, Gilos doesn't know the fate of his wife and children. Because there is no evidence to confirm their deaths, no bodies have been found. For a long time, he lived on hope and government. The searches he once hoped that the plane might have landed urgently on one of the 16,000 uninhabited islands of Indonesia, or been taken hostage somewhere. However, he also had to accept that he seemed to have no chance of meeting his wife and children again. Moreover, he felt even more frightened by the silence of public opinion. All movements have become the past, and no one wants to mention this mysterious yet heart-wrenching disappearance again. The world moves past the past to move forward, but for people like Gelos, fear and pain cannot diminish until the end. MH370 remains unfound, despite numerous hypotheses and many experts on the case. All of humanity's efforts and advances in technology have not yielded results. The ill-fated plane, along with 239 people, has vanished from the world. Perhaps the captain led the passengers to suicide. Perhaps there was a terrorist incident forcing MH370 to crash into the southern Indian Ocean. Or perhaps the plane got lost in a time loophole and will return abruptly one day. The fate of this Malaysian plane depends on the thoughts, perspectives of you, me, and the victims' families, always hoping for the day this mystery will finally be deciphered. Thank you very much, and see you in the next videos. Have a great day, everyone.